Coming up, the government wants to keep your metadata and has rushed legislation into the Parliament.
There's nothing new in these gentlemen and their agencies accessing metadata. So this is in effect a measure designed in large measure to preserve the status quo.
And the direct action policy gets a green light. So what difference has the Senate made? This is Capitol Hill. Welcome to the program. I'm Lyndal Curtis. Having just dispensed with parliamentary approval for its second instalment of counter-terrorism legislation, the government's moved swiftly to introduce the third. A quick meeting of coalition MPs was called this morning to sign off on the bill, which will see metadata retained by telecommunications companies and internet service providers for 2 years. Not long after that, the bill went into the House.
Madam Speaker, I present the Telecommunications Interception and Access Amendment, Data Retention Bill 2014, and the explanatory memorandum. This bill is critical to prevent the capabilities of Australia's law enforcement and national security agencies being further degraded. It does not expand the range of telecommunications metadata which is currently being accessed by law enforcement agencies. It simply ensures that metadata is retained for a period of 2 years.
For the avoidance of doubt, the bill makes it explicit by section 187 A4 that nothing in the bill requires a service provider to keep information about the content of a person's communications, and specific provision is made to exempt from the scope of the bill a person's web browsing history.
It's about preserving the status quo and ensuring that there is a consistency across the board, and we're very satisfied that we have protected, we've taken account of privacy considerations. Again, as George just mentioned, as I said in the House a moment ago, we have substantially reduced the range of agencies that have warrantless access to this type of telecommunications metadata, and it is essentially now limited to what you might describe as traditional law enforcement agencies, police, crime commission, ASIO, customs and so forth.
That this bill confers no new powers on ASIO, the AFP or on law enforcement agencies. They can already access metadata under the existing law.
It's not only for counter-terrorism, but it also applies in ASIO's case for counter-espionage and foreign interference in this country. So for us to perform our function of protecting Australians and Australian interests, we need this access.
Metadata is that fundamental tool that we use. It's the tool that we use often to place people at the scene of a crime or remove them from suspicion. It's the tool that we use to help us refine what further intrusive matters or powers we may need to use down the track. As I say, I can't underscore enough how fundamental it is.
The government has also acted today to address concerns about another aspect of its national security laws. The first package of legislation includes a provision allowing people to be jailed for up to 10 years for revealing information about something that is dubbed a special intelligence operation. The Greens, media organisations and more recently the Labor Party are worried journalists could be targeted under that law. The Attorney-General George Brandis says he'll use his powers to ensure any prosecution of a journalist would require his approval first.
That provision is not about journalists. It was never directed to journalists. Journalists have taken umbrage at it, and rather than let this false story continue to run, I have installed what I'm sure you will see as a very powerful safeguard by having the Attorney-General take personal and therefore political responsibility for any prosecution were any ever to be considered. But as I also said, it's barely imaginable in this country that that would occur.
The opposition leader Bill Shorten wrote to the Prime Minister yesterday expressing his concerns about the new laws covering special intelligence operations. He's asked for a review by the Independent Legislation Monitor. Mr Shorten says he's not satisfied with the Attorney-General's new safeguard.
On one hand, I think we had the Foreign Minister saying nothing to see here, everyone should move along. Then we have George Brandis offering to put on his Superman cape and be there as the sort of last sentinel after on the wall after the public prosecutor might have made the wrong call. I tell you one thing, I'm not excited about having George Brandis deciding the fate of freedom of speech in this country.
The Greens also don't trust the Attorney-General to look after the interests of journalists or whistleblowers. Greens Senator Scott Ludlam told political reporter Julie Doyle he's not happy with George Brandis having the final say over whether a prosecution goes ahead.
I found that safeguard proposal kind of creepy. The first thing the Attorney-General did was he said the legal community, every media organisation in the country and all the other people, including senior Labor figures who've criticised the proposal, are wrong. And he's right. So he will personally take charge of prosecutions of journalists. That, to me, gives rise to two concerns. One, is it just mean that if you're on Team Australia, you won't be prosecuted and others will be thrown to the wolves? And secondly, what about whistleblowers? The way that the Act is drafted doesn't just apply to journalists, it applies to anybody. You can be prosecuted for sharing a link that they don't want you to share on Facebook. So presumably you wouldn't be protected. We will be introducing, and Adam Bant in the House has just announced that would be introducing a measure to actually fix this properly. It should never have been passed into law in the first place.
Is it better, though, to have some kind of safeguard, to have this extra step where the Attorney-General would have to look at any prosecution that was proposed by the DPP?
Yeah, I think it's just as likely to politicise those prosecutions. We've got Senator Brandis signing off on warrants, going after the legal counsel of people who are very concerned and who are involved with ASIS bugging the East Timorese cabinet rooms going back a couple of years. That's just one example. And the Attorney-General's in that case up to his knees. So I think all you would see potentially is the politicisation of these kind of cases. Better that it not be possible that journalists could be prosecuted for doing their job rather than handing that power to George Brandis.
Now, you mentioned that you believe it would be better if this wasn't passed in the first place. Now, Labor has expressed some concerns now after the fact. Yeah. They've asked for a review of this aspect. Yeah. Now, Labor voted for this in the chamber when it went through. So what, is it too little too late from Labor? Yeah,
I mean, the expressions of regret, I can only presume that they're sincere, that after they've gone back and actually seen what it was that they voted for, they've come back and said, well, this is a bit of a problem. So this is Mr Shorten and Mr Albanese. We really could have done with some of that opposition on the night that the bill went through, when Labor were missing in action and it was up to Greens and the rest of the crossbench. I think it's a form of buyer's regret. What we don't want to see happen is for exactly that same thing these people making these comments after they vote for mandatory data retention laws, for example, to say, oh goodness, how could we have done that? We need to draw a very sharp line in the sand on that, and we do need to go back and fix elements of the ASIO bill.
Now, you mentioned the mandatory data retention, so we'll talk about that as well. Now, the bill has been introduced into the House of Representatives today and will go off to committee now. The government says that the legislation excludes keeping of any web browsing history. Are you happy with that?
It's better than it could have been. I think there's no question that agencies and probably the Attorney-General's department wanted web browsing history, which was why we saw that catastrophic interview between the Attorney-General and Sky going back a couple of weeks now. What I think will happen is the government's going to try and bring in a scheme now for 2 years for a certain data set, which they still haven't disclosed. They've introduced a data retention bill which still doesn't have a metadata definition in it. And they'll come back and get other stuff later. When we get to the end of that 2-year period, if this passes into law, and it may not, when we get to the end of the 2-year period, they'll come back and ask for 5. They might formally exclude web traffic now.
Well, you're just assuming that. You don't know that will happen.
These things always proceed by way of scope creep. I simply don't trust them. They'll be after 5 years. They will be after web traffic eventually. These things always proceed into, by scope creep. It's just how it seems to be done.
The government has said today as well, and the security agencies have too, that they're not asking for anything more than what they have now. They're not asking for new powers. They just want to ensure that data is kept for the 2 years. Yeah. What's wrong with that?
I think they should just listen to what industry is telling them. Industry is telling them that that is not true. The reason this is going to be so costly, and there's still no accurate estimate of cost yet, is that it's just not the case. The discussion paper, or the 2 versions of the discussion paper that have been circulated, have been met with a great deal of alarm by the telecommunications industry, who attended an event in Parliament House yesterday and told us that it's simply not true. So the Attorney-General shouldn't be getting up and holding these press conferences about technology that he barely understands when you've got very senior industry figures, including 2 of the key peak bodies in this country, saying it's not true.
But on that though, people who you assume do understand it would be the AFP boss, Andrew Colvin, who spoke also at that press conference today and said that this mandatory data retention is fundamental, he stressed that several times, for their operations and crucial. He cited an example of the Daniel Morecambe case and how crucial it was for the Queensland Police there.
Yeah.
So shouldn't we take on board the advice coming from people like the head of the Australian Federal Police?
Yeah, we should, but that's a different issue to ignoring the advice from the technology sector when they say this is going to be complex and very expensive. The government should be weighing those two things up rather than simply ignoring one side. But the fact is there's already a data preservation regime in place. Australian agencies, from spooks, anti-corruption agencies or regular police agencies, can issue a data preservation notice on particular suspects or targets of an investigation so that material is retained. Now that's proportionate and it's targeted, and yet it's barely used. They're saying actually we should roll this across the entire population just in case. I'd rather see much greater use of data preservation notices and a tightening of the existing access regime, because quite frankly at the moment it's open season on metadata.
Scott Ludlam, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.